Hey guys, Forsberg here. This week we're going to talk about major events in Earth's history. Specifically, how did life change in the Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic eras? By the end of this lesson, you'll be able to identify and analyze data to support the fact that Earth's geological history can be organized by major events. You'll be able to construct explanations using evidence to demonstrate how Earth changed in the Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic eras. Now, there were major events in the Paleozoic era, but we have to start with first talking about Precambrian life. Now, Earth formed 4.6 billion years ago, excuse me, and the rock and fossil records provide a way to document that long history of change. The picture on the right there shows how different life was on Earth 300 million years ago. We see the dragonfly there, and I bet some of you can remember the dragonfly that I have in my classroom in the case and how big we thought that one was. But we once drew on the board that some dragonflies' wingspans were even larger than our arm spans, which is kind of crazy. So the reason we don't start talking about life on Earth until the Paleozoic era is previous to that, in the Precambrian times, the only things that were living were single-celled organisms and the start of the evolution of some multicellular organisms. So let's hop right into the Cambrian explosion. Towards the end of the Precambrian era, more complex organisms evolved. Feathery plants like organisms anchored themselves to the seafloor. Jelly like organisms, which weren't exactly jellyfish, floated in the oceans. Now comes the next phase, the Paleozoic era and the Cambrian explosion. The first part of the Paleozoic era is so crucial and important. It's known as the Cambrian explosion because life took a huge leap forward during this time. Many different kinds of organisms evolved, including some that had hard parts such as shells and exoskeletons. But at this time, all animals lived in the sea. Many animals without backbones, otherwise known as invertebrates, which you should know. Excuse me. Common invertebrates at this time included now the actual jellyfish, worms, sponges, clam like brachiopods, and tribolites. On the right, there is a picture of a tribolite, kind of like a horseshoe crab with antennae. Now, the Ordovician period, the second segment of the Paleozoic era. Remember that eras are huge time spans broken down into smaller time segments known as periods. Well, the Ordovician period here is the second segment, and here is the first vertebrates, including jawless fish that evolved during this time, and vertebrates or animals with backbones. The first insects may have evolved at this time too, along with the land plants. Those land plants are going to become important very soon. Plants grew abundantly during the next period, which was Silurian. These simple plants grew low to the ground in damp areas. By the time we get to the Devonian period that followed, plants evolved that could grow in drier areas. So, because of this, they were now diversifying so that they weren't just near swamps or bodies of water. So, here were our first ferns. Now, both invertebrates and vertebrates did live during this time in the Devonian seas. Even though the invertebrates were more numerous, the Devonian period is often called the Age of Fish. Every main group of fish, including sharks, was present in the ocean. Most of these fish had jaws, bony skeletons, and scales on their bodies. You can see there on the right, we have these creatures that have sort of legs. They look kind of like fish, kind of like crocodiles, and that's because their evolution was occurring. Now we've got the animals reaching land. On the last slide, you saw that the bottom of the Devonian fish, and also some were starting to come out of the water. So the first land vertebrates were lungfish, pictured here on the right, kind of a cross between like a crocodile, alligator, and a fish. The first amphibians evolved from these lungfish. And amphibians are animals that live part of their life on land and part of their life on water. So you can see the early amphibians directly came from these lobed fin fish. You'll notice structural changes. Now we've got animals and plants evolving even further. So now we go into the Carboniferous, again, because we're all carbon-based life forms. This followed the Devonian period in the late Paleozoic era. During this period, the amnionite egg, which is an egg filled with special fluids, evolved. This adaptation was huge because it allowed animals to lay eggs on land without the eggs drying out. This adaptation coincides with the appearance of reptiles. Again, reptiles being animals that have scaly skin and lay eggs that have tough, leathery shells. During the Carboniferous period, winged insects evolved into many new forms, including huge, again, back to longer than our arm span, dragonflies, and cockroaches the size of mice. Giant ferns, mosses, and cone-bearing plants formed a vast swampy forest. And these plants resembled plants that lived in tropical and temperate areas today. You can see some of the huge winged flying dragonflies and plants here, and this was probably one of the first reptiles that lived on land. But again, use his head as a reference for how big those flying bugs really were. Now we get to talk about Pangea, right? The Earth as one large mass, right? It looks almost like a puzzle piece. Over the course of the Paleozoic era, Earth's continents slowly moved together to form a great landmass or supercontinent. The formation of Pangea caused deserts to expand in the tropics and sheets of ice to cover land closer to the South Pole. Then we talk about mass extinction. The end of the Paleozoic era brings the Permian period. This time was known as mass extinction, an event during which many types of living things became extinct at the same time. Scientists estimate that about 90% of all ocean species and about 70% of land species died out. Scientists aren't exactly sure what caused this mass extinction. It could have been multiple volcanoes erupting, putting so much debris and dust into the air, blocking out the sun. Well, when you block out the sun, that obviously is going to change the temperature, not allowing plants to grow. Others think it was a rise in global temperature, and yet others found that the amount of carbon dioxide in the oceans increased, and therefore the amount of oxygen declined. But very likely, all of these factors likely contributed to the mass extinction. Now we move into the next major time era. Again, the larger blocks. And these are the major events in the Mesozoic era. We've got our age of reptiles. We go back to the mass extinction. Few living things managed to survive the Permian mass extinction, but the plants and animals that did survive included the fish, insects, reptiles, and cone-bearing plants called conifers. The reptiles were so successful during the Mesozoic era that this time is often called the Age of Reptiles. The first dinosaurs appeared in the first period in this Mesozoic era, called the Triassic period. And then we also have our first mammals occurring during the Triassic period. A mammal is a vertebrate that can control its own body temperature and feed milk to its young. Mammals in the Triassic period were very small, only about the size of a mouse, like this cute little fella here. Then we get to these scary reptiles and birds. During the Jurassic period, which is probably the period you guys have heard the most about, which is the second segment of the Mesozoic era, dinosaurs were the dominant land animals. And scientists have identified several hundred different kinds of dinosaurs, including some that ate plants and some that were predators. One plant-eating dinosaur, Brachiosaurus, was 26 meters long. The ocean and the seas during this period were also filled with diverse life forms, including sharks, rays, giant marine crocodiles, and plesiosaurs. Plesiosaurs had long necks and paddle-like fins. Late in the Jurassic, the first known birds appeared in the sky. This type of Archaeopteryx sorry, which literally means ancient winged one, is thought to have evolved from a dinosaur. The sky also had flying reptiles called pterosaurs and many varieties of insects. So if you look at these two here, we can see how the Archaeopteryx and the Dimorphodon, sorry, I'm terrible with dinosaur names, but you can see how one could be able to be suited for more for land and one more for the air. Then we get to our flowering plants. This is in the Cretaceous period. It's the final and longest segment of the Mesozoic era. The reptiles, including dinosaurs, were still widespread. Ancient birds evolved better adaptations for flying. And one of the most important things that happened here was the evolution of flowering plants, otherwise known as an angiosperm. Unlike conifers, the flowering plants now are producing seeds that are inside of fruit. So this gave more variety of foods to the species existed. Some of the things that came out of it that we still recognize today are magnolias, figs, and willows. We have another mass extinction. Run, dinosaurs, run. A huge asteroid may have come down, and this caused a lot of volcanic activity in where we would call India now, and it had a weakened environment. This again wiped out more than half plants and animal groups, including the dinosaurs. Bye bye, dinosaurs. So then, lastly, we move into the Cenozoic era. Now, leading up to the Cenozoic era, we talked about those small mammals, but they had to compete with dinosaurs and other animals. But with them now gone, mammals were able to flourish and evolve to live in many different environments on land, in water, and even in the air. So this is the Cenozoic era begins with Paleogene and Neogene periods. The climate cooled over time. We had whales and dolphins, and then we've got the Ice Age. At the start of the Quaternary period, large sheets of ice begin to appear on Earth's surface. Earth's climate continued to cool and warm in cycles, causing what we now know as our seasons. Here comes the humans. In the Quaternary period, it's sometimes referred to as the Age of Humans. Homo erectus, an ancestor of modern humans, appears in fossil records near the start of this period, while modern humans appeared only about 190,000 years ago. By about 12,000 to 15,000 years ago, humans had migrated to every continent except Antarctica. On the next two slides, you'll see the timeline showing the major events that we just covered, broken down into their periods, how many years ago they began, and the highlights that we've talked about. This will be really good for when you're reviewing. Okay, so again, we've got the Precambrian, the Paleozoic broken into the 6 periods. We've got the Mesozoic broken down into 3 periods, and then finally Cenozoic broken down into 3 periods. You have this PowerPoint to go back and refer to at any time, and as always, do your best work.